Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Cabernet and Pray. Today, we're exploring a book called The Space Between Us, written by Sarah Bauer Anderson. And Sarah is a native of Washington, D.C. She's currently living just north of Atlanta in Roswell, Georgia. She's married to her husband, Rodney, for 18 years, and they have two boys who are 14 and 12. The past 20 years, Sarah has worked in church and nonprofit church spaces, predominantly writing, editing, and speaking. She wrote this book, and the subtitle is How Jesus Teaches Us to Live Together When Politics and Religion Pulls Us Apart, which is a very needed subject right now. And in the book, she shares her experience growing up in a politically active and evangelical family as the daughter of a former presidential candidate, which is an interesting story to tell, and how she has navigated her own shifting theological and political views in her family. She is incredibly fun and incredibly thoughtful, and there's so much about her story that I think you will relate with as we get into it in this episode. So enjoy episode 29, The Space Between Us.
I've never shared this with anybody publicly. There's so many things happening in this conversation right now. 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking at this podcast saying, so this was the breakthrough.
If this was SportsCenter, that would be like such a hot take. Skip Bayless would have no idea. Stephen A. Smith would have no idea what to say if you drop that down. That is so good.
The joke I always say is like, how'd you learn so much? You got to drink a lot.
The power of food and beverage to lubricate an environment.
Resistance to change is hurting the church.
I'm not in the camp that God has a penis or a vagina or a body at all. I'm in the camp that God is a universal spirit.
This is the strangest podcast that I've been on. I don't even know what to do.
I'm kind of geeked up about this wine.
So this is my second glass, and it delivers a little more of a punch than I expected. So if I get a little loopy, it's your fault. You told me to drink on the show.
You've uncovered the mystery. You've exposed the formula.
You've just duct taped together a number of things that aren't normally hanging out together, and I'm here for it.
We're going to sit down at a table, we're going to have a glass of wine and some food, and we're going to talk about the beauty of Jesus.
Thank you for the hospitality that this particular podcast provides folks like myself, and I know others, to be curious around their faith practices.
I will never forget the first time I bought a bottle of wine by myself, which was yesterday.
If you're familiar with drunk history, I thought it's like drunk theology.
By the way, drinking this Pinot Grigio at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is making me even more direct in my communication than I normally would be.
All right. Well, we are super excited to have Sarah Anderson on the podcast with us today. Thanks for joining us, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
All right. Well, let's begin by talking about some super important stuff, the stuff that we're drinking in our glasses. I'll go first, and then we'll see what Sarah's got in her glass as well. Today, I'm drinking one of my absolute favorites, and it felt like a good excuse to open this bottle. This is a 2021 Archery Summit Paradox Pinot Noir from Oregon, which is just it has my heart. And Archery Summit is the place. We're members there, and if I'm in Oregon, anywhere near Archery Summit, I'm going to stop in there. And I've been drinking this for a little bit, getting ready for the podcast, and I'm getting some fruit notes of cranberry and plum. And then this one's got a lot of really interesting kind of earthy notes. I'm getting mushroom, graphite, and then the longer it's been sitting in my glass, I'm starting to get some potting soil in it. So a little bit of literally like that earthy vibe. But I was reading the bottle, Sarah, and it made me think of you. So I don't normally read what's on the bottle, but I thought this was cool for our conversation today. So this is called Paradox, and then they have this on the back label. A paradox is all about contradictions. In archery, it sums up the phenomenon of aiming slightly off-center to hit the bullseye. The same can be true of winemaking, so often improved by being a bit unconventional.
Okay.
So I thought kind of cool, but here's where I went with it is I thought this was a great segue into the ideas in your book, because I think you're a little unconventional how you're trying to go about bridging, in particular, a political, religious divide that is between us. And some would say cannot be bridged. This is hopeless. And you're going after it, and you're going after it, and you're aiming slightly off center with some of your ideas. And I think you're hitting the bullseye. And I'm excited to talk about your ideas today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We got to hear what's in your glass. And
okay.
What do you?
I love that. I love that description. That's fantastic. So I've never been compared to a wine bottle description. So thank you. That was my first. Okay, so I'm drinking a red blend. And when I was originally, like when I first started drinking wine, I was only a white wine person. And so this was like my gateway to red wine, was a blend. And this is a Conundrum is the name of it. It's from California. And it's a 2021. And I will be honest with you, I don't know a whole lot about wine. This is probably an area where I'm probably the most submissive to my husband is when it comes to wine. I'm like, tell me what to order. Tell me what it tastes like. I'm just going to follow your lead on this one. But it's, I do know that I don't like a thin wine. I know I like a kind of a rich, more bold, and I feel like this isn't, but it's not bitter. So I love that it kind of has like this richness to it, but it kind of can hold its own. I don't think you need to eat it with anything. Like you can just sip it, and it's our special occasion wine. I'll say that it's like the wine we get when we're celebrating, and yeah.
Well, I feel super honored that we in this podcast made it to your special occasion wine.
Yes. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers to you, and to any of our listeners or those watching. If you're joining with us and you have a glass, cheers to you as well.
Yes.
Hopefully you've got something fun. That's awesome. Okay, before we get into your book, I want to ask a question that I love asking our guests. Yeah. This just kind of helps all of us get a little bit of a gauge for who you are and your journey. As you look at, we'll just say the last 10 years, we'll keep it to a specific window. How has your faith changed over the last 10 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say probably my faith started to really begin to change when I was pregnant with my oldest. So that was more like 15 years ago. But I think that was when I started to become more comfortable with asking some bigger questions around some of the ideas and theologies that had kind of been passed along to me. So 10 years specifically, I remember thinking, I've got a almost 5-year-old at this point. He's paying attention to what I'm saying and what I'm teaching in a way that he hasn't before. And how comfortable do I feel kind of passing along some of these ideas now that he's beginning to internalize them in a way that he hadn't before. So I would say the way that my faith has changed in a broad sense has been kind of really leaning into more mystery and more uncertainty and not seeing that as a bad thing. I am like the most Enneagram 6 of 6s that you can imagine. And so yes, the loyalist, but a high security need. And so I feel like with my faith, certainty offered this sense of security in a lot of ways. And there was a sense of control there that I really held on to. And I think once I became a parent and realized how much is out of your control, and in a lot of ways, just in parenting, but also in a lot of other ways, I began to see that there was some freedom in that uncertainty, and there is some freedom in that lack of control. And so if I could describe kind of like an image of my faith changing, I would say it's gone from a closed fist to just kind of opening a little bit more and loosening my grip on some things. And the things that I hold tightly to are just becoming fewer and farther between. Like I just am finding I don't have the energy for some of the theology that I just was willing to die on before. I just don't do it. I'm just not sure it matters anymore is the other piece. So I'm feeling like there's a lot of freedom in that. But, the specific areas I've probably found some change in specifically probably would have to do moving away from the idea of punitive justice to restorative justice. I didn't even know that there were different ways of understanding justice until these past 10 years of seeing Justice is not just a punishment, or not just kind of like this eye for an eye mentality, or separating out and kind of alienation, but looking at justice as something that restores a relationship and that's bringing healing and wholeness to something, and seeing God through that lens, not just a punitive God, but a restorative God. I feel like I started to know that there were different atonement theories out there. I've been raised my whole life to hear one kind of atonement theory, penal substitutionary atonement, and being like, oh, that's a theory. Like, this isn't the only one. There's other options. So that's been really freeing. I've learned more about and leaned more into universal salvation and reconciliation, and that wasn't something that Rob Bell invented, that this was something early church fathers had talked about. And this was a doctrine that it wasn't heresy at the time. Yeah. And kind of leaning into this idea of universal reconciliation and God drawing everybody to himself, leaning into desert fathers, desert mothers, mystics. I started reading, I don't know if you're familiar with Brad Jersak. He's an author, and I started reading his books, Jesus and a More Christ-like Word, and a More Christ-like Way, and a More Christ-like God. And it changed everything for me. He was traditionally evangelical, and then I think he converted to Eastern Orthodox. And because of his books, I started Instagram stalking him, found out that he was president of this university, and started taking classes with them. And I'm in the process of getting my master's through his university, and just being exposed to Eastern Orthodoxy. Like, there's a half of Christianity that exists that I did not know existed, 10 years ago. And just feeling like I had been living what I thought was kind of like in the whole of Christianity, and realizing I was just in this small little kind of tributary, and that there was so much more out there. And if there's this phrase that I feel like has resurfaced over and over again in the past few years, especially, it's learning that there are so many ways to faithfully follow Jesus, and just finding so much freedom in all those different possibilities. So, I would say I hold a lot less tightly to a lot of things. And I found that I'm drawn more and more to people who aren't necessarily sharing my same beliefs, but whose posture is the same, and that we could have a completely different worldview on how we see the world, or God, or, an existence or belief in God, but we have a curiosity toward one another. And I think there was a time prior to 10 years ago when it would have been much more important to share the beliefs than it would have been our approach to beliefs. So I would say those are probably the biggest kind of benchmarks faith changes.
My goodness, that was a great answer. I mean, I just am like in awe of all that you covered in one question. That's incredible. You are certainly a kindred spirit of many of the ideas that we talk about on this podcast are right in line with that. And I think that's just a refreshing perspective. And this is so great to have this conversation with you, because I've been reading your book, and the book is called The Space Between Us. And, what's funny is you talk about growing up in this very conservative home, and, your dad was a Republican presidential candidate. And some of the stories, are just things that, like, us common folk can't really wrap our heads around. Like, I'm reading this going, holy cow, that would be wild. But I know what it feels like to have parents who are way more conservative than I am. And I know, what it feels like to grow up and, just to talk, politics for a second. I grew up, I think, very similar to you. I thought Republican Party was the only, like, we were the only ones out there. It's like, there's this other one, like, nobody voted. And, that was kind of like my kid view of the world. Like, all the good ones are Republican. And then as I've gotten older, I've changed my view on that and explored it differently. And there's just a whole bunch that goes with that. And you do such a great job in this book. And so I'm just gonna give a hearty plug the entire podcast for any of our listeners, those watching. This is one of those, you actually wrote this 4 years ago. And it could have been written yesterday, because it's only intensified. All the ideas you addressed here have only intensified. None of it has decreased. And it's so good. Now, I picked a few passages that I want to unpack, that things that I love reading books when I know I'm going to interview the author, because I read it differently, where I'm like, oh, we're going to get into that. That's a brilliant idea. So I feel like I have to start in a certain spot, and you probably understand why. But here's from the book. Sarah writes that, in the story of Jesus's first miracle, I find it interesting that Jesus isn't healing a physical ailment or righting a deformity present since birth. For his first miracle, he's at a party, a wedding, when suddenly the wine runs out. Friends, this is what we're here for, to make sure this never happens. No one's life is on the line. Inclusion in the religious community isn't up for grabs, and foundational theological teaching isn't about to be revealed. No. For Jesus's first miracle, it's better than that. Then you say this: Jesus turns the water into wine because of what it means for the party, because that's what food and drink do. It's what they've always done. They remember, they close space, they make better. Now, I feel professionally obligated to point out this passage on a podcast called Cabernet and Pray. So I've done my professional duty. I want to hear from you. You have clearly lived in this space, this in-between space. Talk to us more about the power of food and drink to aid us in bridging the divide between us.
Yeah. Well, I think, we've heard alcohol especially referred to as like a social lubricant, right? And I think, and there's something to that. There is something to this, a little bit of letting our guards down a little bit and kind of engaging in a conversation in a way and being able to talk about things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise. I know that in my book, I talk about we're not as much a wine family in my family, but we are Manhattan drinkers, and my dad has a Manhattan recipe. And so for me and my family and our experience, so many good memories revolve around the pouring of the Manhattans, when we all get together for Christmas, or we all go out to dinner when it's all the grown-up adult night out. And there's something that's familiar about it. That's just, I think there's something to the tradition and the consistency around the shared drink that I think is really important. But I think it's one of those things that there's probably a scientific reason to it, but I don't know that it's as important to know why it's like that as much as it is to realize it is like that, and to recognize when people come around a table, something happens, right? And I think it could be something as basic as it reveals our humanity, right? I mean, there's something about coming around a table and eating and drinking together that is a great equalizer, because it doesn't matter your economic status, your gender, your political party, your financial bracket, your ethnicity. Everybody needs to eat and drink. Everybody needs food. Everybody needs water. This is as basic as our humanity gets. And so I think there's something symbolic in all of us coming together and being like, you don't ever age out of this need. You don't ever become wealthy enough where you don't need this anymore. It's like we all need this sustenance. And so I think there is an equalizer to that. I think when you come around good food, there's something about a shared experience and kind of engaging all of your senses that makes it a more memorable experience. It's a more holistic experience when you've got all these things kind of going on at the same time. But I just know that there's something really powerful that happens, and science has shown that. They consider families that eat together on a regular basis, they consider that a keystone habit, that is literally a habit that ends up overflowing into other areas of your life as a parent and your life with your kids and makes them better. And I don't know why that's true, but it's true. So to me, I just think my life is more enriched by the conversations and the intentionality that happen when you're gathered around a shared space. And I don't know which came first, if it was the science or the symbolism with Jesus in the Last Supper and the wedding feast and the banquets, but I just know that they're tracking with each other. Science is saying something is true, and I think our faith is saying something that's true, and I think we've lived that it's true, that there's something about food and drink that that's magical.
You talk about this so strongly in your book, and I had to chuckle because, and I don't remember how you worded it, but you made some comment like, my dad would like to go on record saying I'm overplaying the Manhattans, or something. You had some comment like, dad wants to just downplay this a little bit, like maybe I'm exaggerating. I thought that's so good when you're like, no, this was such a big deal for us. And Dad's like, come on. It wasn't that big.
Well, he has a lot of conservative Christian donors who don't drink. So we've got to make sure that this is not the keystone to our family.
Well, I actually applaud you and him because you kind of outed him as a drinker in this book. And so, how much he drinks, we can, I guess, debate. But definitely, that he drinks. So kudos to both of you for being willing to talk about that.
That's right.
I think that's cool. Okay, you have another idea that I loved. You said, I've learned that one of the trickiest things about becoming an adult is learning how to bring my adult self into childhood relationships, or of having to, quote, reintroduce myself to everyone I know, end quote, as Lauryn Hill said, my family of origin in particular. Mm-hmm. I think this is so great. This is why I love asking people the 10-year question, right? Yeah. Because none of us are static. None of us, we're born with all the right opinions and all the right ideas and everything. We are a work in progress, and that's messy. Right. And when it's your spirituality and your beliefs about God that you're working through and you're changing, it's not just a journey for you. It's a journey for everyone around you who knows you, or as you're referencing, who knew the old you, right? Like you used to believe this and you used to teach this and you used to agree with this. And then as you're on this journey, you go, well, I don't believe that anymore. I don't see it that way anymore. And you didn't reference this particular, but I think about the people in the deconstructing community, who a lot of those are people that I'm in that circle a lot. And, it's almost like, well, their family and their friends look at them like, you chose this, for fun. Like you had your hobby. And they're like, no, I can't believe what I used to believe, and so there's this idea of having to reintroduce myself. How have you learned how to do that? You seem like you have a really good ability to change what you believe, things that in your own journey, but then to not let that alienate yourself from your family, from your friends. What are some things you've learned in doing that well?
I wouldn't say I've done it well. I've done it. I'm doing it. But I think it's important to know that some of us go through this in more dramatic ways than others, but all of us go through this. I mean, there is something about becoming an adult where you have to kind of disassociate yourself from the person you were in your first 18 years of life in your parents' home or whatever that situation was, and just realizing everybody's starting to see each other as we aren't going to stay who we were for that time period. And realizing every time you go home, you're having to fight falling back into old patterns and old roles and labels and that sort of thing. So we've all done it. I think everybody deserves a toast to that who's managed to navigate that change. But I think it is particularly challenging when it comes to politics and religion, because those are identity pieces. And I think so many of us, when we grew up in families where politics and religion was important, they shaped who we were, how we saw ourselves, and how other people saw us. And so to change that is to change something foundational to you. So I think one of the first things we have to do, and I feel like I had to do, was really just learn how to not just reintroduce myself to my family and people who knew me one way. I had to reintroduce myself to myself, right? To change my theology, to change my political ideas, is to shed a skin. And there is raw skin underneath that needs some toughening up, that needs some adaptability and learning how to live in again. And I think we do our families and our relationships a disservice when we put the pressure on them to accept us who we are as we are and who we are, without having first done the work ourselves to be like, am I fully embodied in this new identity? Am I accepting of myself, or am I outsourcing this acceptance and counting on somebody else to provide for me what it's not actually their job to do? It's not up to them to provide the acceptance that I need for myself. Do I accept who this is? Do I understand who I am now? So I think that's been the first step of really leaning into this identity and unapologetically being like, okay, this is who I am. And when I come to terms with who I am, I don't need others to confirm or accept or endorse who I am. That's an internal job first. So I think that's really important. I think that's the first part of it. Honestly, this is probably a terrible answer, but I live in Georgia. My entire family still lives in the DC area. And I think there is a gift to the physical distance. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that there was a very tangible separating out, and I left home and started a family somewhere else. And so when I come back, it is like a reintroduction to me every time I come home. And I think that families that stay closer together, that's harder to do. And I'm not saying one way is better than the other. I'm just saying that's a reality that I've experienced, that having that physical distance allows that reintroduction to be, to come more easily. But I think just practically speaking, I think the best thing that we can do is not to approach it from a posture of superiority or authority and be like, well, this is who I am now. And why aren't you interested, or why aren't you accepting of this? But to continue to have that mindset of growth, like you're talking about, like who we were 10 years ago isn't who we are today. Well, who we are going to be 10 years from now isn't who we are today. So being able to approach this and be like, you know what, I've kind of started thinking about this, or I've kind of started to lean in this direction, and it's curious to me, or I've just started to wonder, and to use these more open-ended phrases, these invitations for conversation, instead of these declarative sentences that say, this is who I am, or you take me or leave me. It's more like, I'm kind of exploring this, I'm kind of leaning into this, and what do you think about this? And leaving that space for engagement, and not just kind of teaching at and talking to, but engaging with.
So if someone is listening to this and they're like, man, I just can't seem to make it work with my family, they need to move, is what you're saying.
That's 100%. You got it. I think we could end there.
You got to get out of town. You just got to get away.
You heard it here first.
Oh, that's great. No, and I think, that's what's so great in the book is you do talk about the way your family has navigated this. And that's one of those, I just think so many people resonate with that of like, oh yeah, we have some of this in our family. And certainly there are families that do it well and seem to navigate it and stay connected. And then there's others that's like, we don't know how to do this, and we don't know how to navigate this well. And this has, created a rift. And I think those are some of the saddest stories I hear from people who, they're like, I haven't talked to my parents in a year, and just some of the divides that just get created. And it's like,
yeah. And I think it's important to know when it comes to these relationships, it is a two-way street, right? Like you can be doing all the right things. And if you are wanting to engage in a dialogue and the other person's wanting to engage in a debate, like it's not going to work out. And so I think there really is something to feeling a freedom and to be like, you do your part. You keep your side of the street clean. You make the move that you can make, but knowing that relationship really is about this give and take and this back and forth. And I'm not saying that means that any relationship is beyond repair, but it is so helpful when you've got the willing parties already involved, right? You're not having to re-engage somebody.
Okay. So when you look with your relationship with your parents, did you ever have seasons where it felt like this isn't going to work, and then something happened, you guys got over it, or there was a breakthrough, or has it always kind of been a steady, we're navigating it?
I would say there have definitely been seasons where the specifics of certain politics, certain political issues, or certain political figures is off the table. And it wasn't a deliberate conversation of like, hey, we can't talk about this. For me, I've just started to pay more attention to my physical reaction to certain conversations and topics coming up. And if I feel myself getting riled up, and I know neither one of us is coming at this from a posture of curiosity and actually wanting to understand that this is going to escalate into more like debate style, then it's not worth it, because nobody here is going to actually change their minds based off of something one of us has said. But the conversations that go the best are the ones when there's question asking. I mean, I'll never forget, I didn't put this in the book, I don't think, but this is such a small thing, but it may have been for the 2020 election. My dad knew that I was not thrilled with the Republican nominee and a lot of the things happening in the Republican Party. And all he did was say, well, I'd love to know who are the Democrats that interest you. This was still in the primary season. Who are you drawn to, and what are the things that they're talking about that you like? And it wasn't like a judgmental, it was like a genuine curiosity. And I will never forget it. And I know that is so small, but you have to understand that coming from my dad, who's been a card-carrying Republican, like you said, ran for the Republican nominee for president in 2000. I mean, this is in his blood. And for him to even be able to say, I'd love to know what about the Democrats interest you because you're my dad. That makes such a difference in how the dialogue happens. But yes, there are definitely times where I can tell this is a debate. This is not a conversation. And so I'm not interested in having a debate. If it's not going to help me understand you better, if it's not going to help me understand your positions better, then I'm not sure anybody's winning in this. And so I think we need to be willing to say, we don't these conversations doesn't mean we say yes to every conversation. It means we've got to pay attention to where are we emotionally, where are we relationally? Is this actually strengthening the relationship, or is this causing potential harm? And just know it's a boundary, really. It's saying, we're not saying we have to talk about this all the time, every time, but when is this helpful and when is it not? So yeah, there's definitely been times when that's been off the table.
My wife and I are both Enneagram 8s, which is
okay.
It's a unique marriage, and which means we're the challenge. So we're very comfortable in a conversation going into the danger zone. Of that's just the way we're wired. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've had to learn, and kind of some of our terminology, even though this is an ironic image because I'm very committed to nonviolence. However, I use the image. Like you only have so many bullets in your gun, so you can't fire every bullet. And you pick the bullets that you go, this bullet is really important to me. Meaning, not a literal bullet, but an idea. Like this thing I've got to say. And you know what means I'm going to let that one go. And just that tension of you don't want to have a gun that just clicks because you have nothing left, to use. There's nothing left to engage in because you fired every single thing you had. And we have to kind of remind each other, like, all right, we don't need to fight that one. Let's let that one go. And so I think it's encouraging to hear your story of like, there's times, and I also just, kudos to your dad for being willing to ask a curious question. Like, what a great reminder to all of us.
I love that analogy. I feel like I've heard it said also, when every hill is a hill to die on, none of them are, right? It's like you start to lose your effectiveness and your power of persuasion when every issue is the most important issue, right? And so it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, save it for the stuff that matters, because then you start to become white noise otherwise, and you really lose your influence. So I think that takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of self-control. And again, being able to read the room, read the emotional temperature coming from the other person, your own. I mean, it is a dance, but I think
how many Manhattans you've had. I mean, there's a lot of variables.
That's right. Because there's a sweet spot. One Manhattan could be good. But after that, no.
No, I usually, make everything good with just bring a really nice bottle of wine and everybody chill out,
Yes.
Conversations are better.
Do it. Yeah.
All right, let's get into another idea that I loved. You say, I think we are where we are in this fractious era because at some point we started believing that talking about politics and religion is uncomfortable, and uncomfortable things ought to be avoided. As a result, the muscle used to debate kindly, speak openly, and converse respectfully has atrophied. We've forgotten how. Couple that with a low tolerance for innocent misspeaking, naive ignorance, and divergent thinking, and it's no wonder we've arrived where we have. We are the product of our own unwillingness to talk about tough topics well, and our choice to deal with it all by avoiding it. I love the metaphor here of the atrophied muscle, that we all have the muscle and we've collectively decided not to use it, and this muscle has shrunk and we're kind of deformed looking. How do we hit the gym and get this muscle back?
I think it needs to go back even further than just learning how to talk about uncomfortable things. I think it needs to go back to the only way that we've seen politics talked about, especially since 2016, I don't think it was always this way, but especially since 2016, is in debate mode, and it is character attacks, and it is labels, and it is the most base way of interacting around politics. So it's not just that we don't want to talk about uncomfortable things. What we're witnessing and how our leaders are talking about it is super unhealthy. So we don't have a good example of what this looks like. So I think for me, it's understanding that there's a different way to do it than maybe what we've observed, first of all. I think the other thing is changing the objective. I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, but if our objective in these conversations around politics is to change somebody's mind, then we're playing a losing game. Like, very rarely are we going to present any kind of a fact or any kind of emotional argument where at the end, the person on the other side goes, you're right. I actually am not going to vote that way anymore. Thanks. Like that so rarely happens. So like, we need to take that off the table. That's like out of our pay grade to try to convince somebody to think differently on some things, and change the objective to understanding. And again, this sense of curiosity and where somebody is coming from and how they arrived at that place, because that you can control. You can't control somebody else changing your mind, but you can control how well you are willing to understand where they landed. And so for me, I think when I think of politics, I think that there's 3 different approaches we can have to some of these issues and just the topic in general. We can do this debate style, where the objective is literally to out-argue you and to be the quickest on my feet and to make you look dumb with whatever kind of argument you're presenting, but I'm going to win. That's the objective, and to try to get you to change your mind or look foolish. We can have a discussion, which I think is less emotional, but it's more fact-based. And it's just kind of like, listen, if you just saw the facts the way that I saw them, then you would change your mind and think the way that I do. So I think the objective there is probably more to outsmart or to convince somebody of something different. But the third way, and I think the most effective way where everybody wins, is to have a dialogue. And that's not, in a dialogue, I'm not trying to get you to think the way that I think. I'm trying to understand the way you think. So now the responsibility is on me as a listener and not as a talker trying to argue something. In a dialogue, it's this back and forth. It's this dance. It's a mutual respect. I'm not trying to make you look dumb. I'm not trying to make you look stupid or feel stupid. I'm trying to understand how you got where you got when it came to your positions. And so I think just understanding these different approaches can change the way that we go at it. Because I think if we only ever see politics as debate, then there's those of us who, first of all, hate arguing. So we're like, I don't want anything to do with that. Like, that sounds terrible. I'll sound dumb and be out argued every time. Those of us who love it, but will end up alone because we've isolated all the people who are close to us by the way we debate them. Yeah. Neither one of those is winning options, right? So I think we have to start looking at this as a way of this mutual give and take, this back and forth where I am a student of you. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm trying to learn from you. You are the expert of your opinion and your position. So I want to understand how you got there. And so I think we begin to work that muscle when we begin to see the relationship as the objective and not changing somebody's mind as the objective.
Okay. So you are making me think of one of my neighbors who, I don't know if I've shared this story in the podcast before, but I'm listening to you talk and I'm like having this kind of like, oh man, I'm just thinking of this guy. He is probably in his late 80s to 90s. He rides a 3-wheel bicycle. I mean, like the slowest bike speed you've seen. He's on the sidewalk and he'll just slowly pedal out. And so he goes so slow. I see him all the time in my neighborhood. Like, just because he's not covering ground quickly. But I think good for him. Like you are, 80s, 90s, whatever. I mean, he's an old dude and he's out there getting some physical exercise. It's great. A few months back, he added 2 flags to the back of his bike, an American flag and then a Trump flag. And then he added this sign on the back of his bike that said honk. So something like honk for a vote for Trump or something. And now I see this guy and I have a very different reaction to it. And I'm like, what would possess this man? It's like, and again, I don't care who you vote for. I'm not putting any candidates anything on my bike. You know,
Right.
like I'm like, okay, you can like your candidate, but like there's just a level of you're spending probably the last years of your life like riding your bike around trying to get people to honk for this candidate. And I look at that and I'm like, what is going on? But as I'm listening to you, I'm like, you know, the reality is I don't understand him. I don't understand what on earth, you know, is possessing him to do that. And so I'm like feeling this like sense of conviction of like, should I go introduce myself? I'd be like, all right, help me understand what's up with the bike. Like why?
Yeah.
You know, that's you're saying something that in one sense is so simple, like just try to understand someone. But as you apply it to like real life scenarios, you're like, oh, that sounds like the hardest thing in the world.
Well, and I think it is because of the way that our culture operates. I mean, you know, when it comes to social media, our lives are not oriented around dialogue anymore. They're oriented around sound bites, and they're oriented around these really quick labels that we can put, you know, to describe who we are in our bios. And it's not oriented toward the more nuanced explanations of who we are. And so, I mean, it makes sense that this has happened. I think we're responsible, but we're also victims of kind of the time and age that we're living in. So I think it's understandable that we got here. I think it's going to take some time to go back and to recalibrate, but I don't, you know, we didn't end up here by accident. Though there were certain things created and made that got us here, and we just, you know, played along with what we were given.
All right, fine, I'll think about it.
Bring him a glass of wine.
Oh man, yeah. There you go. I just bring one. Hey, you and I need to drink this, and we need to talk. And I have some questions for you. That's great. That's right. All right. One more quote from the book that I loved. You say, maybe one of the biggest tasks before us is to learn to make the distinction between what is different thinking and what is harmful thinking. What is a different value versus what is outright hate? Peacemaking is possible between two competing ideas, but not between good and evil. And so to be peacemakers, we need to learn to see others who value things differently than we do, who have placed more importance on morality foundations different from our own, not necessarily as an enemy, but as a different representation of a value we may not prioritize. And in partnering with them, we can begin to create the sort of world we ultimately want to live in. Now, Sarah, I think this is a fantastic way of thinking this. Is this person that I'm reacting to, is this a different way of thinking, or is this harmful thinking? And I think most of us would quickly say it's all harmful, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, it takes a little bit of like, okay, slow down, analyze it a little bit more, figure out what is the harm in it? You know, where do you see the harm? And then maybe open the door that it's just different. It's not necessarily harmful. So I have two questions on this one. Do you think we often get these confused where we are assuming everything is harmful and maybe it's not? And then how do we better learn to recognize the difference between these types of thinking?
Yeah. The answer to the first question is yes. I think we do often get it confused. And I think the reason for that is it requires to judge something as harmful requires a lot less mental energy than to engage something that's different and to be able to parse out the nuance and what's good or what's bad, or what I agree with or disagree with in a particular idea. So I think we tend to move towards these really kind of polar opposite ideas and mutually exclusive kind of characteristics for these views because it's easy. And our brains like easy. They want a shortcut. So to be able to look at that and be like bad and put it in the box and be done is so much easier for us to do. And it just requires a lot of mental legwork to look at something as different. And I would say, you know, you alluded a little bit to the family you grew up in and your experience of Republican equals Christian. And that was my experience too. And it took me a very long time to be able to see any kind of democratic policy as different and not just harmful or bad. And the biggest help to me in this was, you know, I mentioned it in the quote that you read, was the idea of morality foundations. And I came across this idea, it was several years ago now, But Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist. He came up with this idea of moral foundations. And in his book, The Righteous Mind, he talks about these sort of intuitive ethics that every single one of us is born with. So regardless of your age, your culture, your ethnicity, whatever, you are born with a set of intuitive ethics. And then depending on how you were raised and where you were raised in the culture that you're coming from, certain of those ethics kind of rise to the top and resonate with you more as a person than other ones. And he makes the comparison of all these moral foundations. I think he talks about either 6 or 7 in his book. These moral foundations are like taste buds. And he says we're born with the capacity for all of them. But just like a person has a preference for sweet or for salty, we have a preference for these different moral foundations. And he says the problem is when it comes to our politics, we don't treat it like taste buds. We treat it like mutually exclusive ideas. But no one's saying, I prefer sweet, so therefore salty things should not exist, right? But that's what we're doing with our politics. We're saying, I believe in these ideals, therefore the ideals of this party are harmful and bad, and they need to go away. And so his point in this book was to look at the two-party political system in the United States. He pointed out that for Republicans, there are certain moral foundations that resonated more. They had to do, I think, with honor and authority and loyalty and maybe a couple of other ones. And that Democrats, there are other moral foundations that resonated with them, having to do with compassion, care, and a couple of other ones for them as well. And he said, we need all of these. We don't want to live in a world where care and compassion are off the table. And we don't want to live in a world where honor and authority to a degree are off the table, that there is a way for all of these to come together and to work in a harmony. And that isn't to say that there isn't going to be tension and which one should take precedence or not, but we have to begin by saying, we don't want a world where half of these are gone completely. Like that's not the ideal. And so the ideal is beginning to figure out what is this dance that we want them all to have with one another, and beginning to recognize the value that these different foundations bring. So when I read that, when I spent more time in this book and kind of researching more of the righteous mind and the morality foundations behind it, I was like, this changes everything. Like it helps me understand so much more that there's nuance behind all of this, and that there is a value add that comes to these moral foundations that mine might not have. And so what do those things bring to the table? So I think that understanding the moral foundations is helpful. It helps me understand how people arrived at the opinions they did. And I think it adds layer of nuance between a way a person votes and my judgment of them, right? So I think too easily we're saying they voted this way, that's harmful, that makes them a bad person. And I think the moral foundations helps us say, okay, they voted this way. Where did that come from? What moral foundation does that appeal to? And what was their experience that made that moral foundation matter to them? So instead of just connecting one straight line between this was a harmful vote, harmful behavior, harmful person, it's saying, okay, this could be a harmful behavior, but what happened to this person that made them think this was the best option for them, whatever that vote was, and not just saying, not equating a vote with a bad person. It just allowing that curiosity again to kind of go in there. So I think, again, it requires a lot more mental legwork than I think we're willing to do. But that nuance is what's needed, and it's what we're lacking. And I think that's the nuance is where the magic happens, and where at least, even if I still don't agree, I can understand where you came from. Most people arrived at the positions they arrived at. Either it was handed down to them, or something happened that made them think this was the best way forward. And so we've just got to get rid of this immediate judgment. Even if that vote, even if that position led to a behavior or led to an action that ended up being harmful, that isn't necessarily where it started. The intent wasn't always harm. So how do we get back to the intent? How do we get back to the moral foundation that sets somebody off down this path, and just learning from there?
That's so good. And, a lot of times we think people just kind of abstractly chose these ideas that look ridiculous to us. And we don't understand. Maybe that's meeting some need for them, or some emotional thing that, that really resonates with them. And again, going back to your earlier point, unless we take the time to understand them, like why do you like that? And what is, interesting about that? We may never connect the dots to go, oh, how did you ever land there. We just look from afar and go, that idea is stupid.
Yes.
Like,
and Jonathan Haidt talks about this a lot, and this shows up in a lot of different places. But one of the things he says is we tend to think of ourselves as rational creatures. We like to think that we are so well thought out, our positions, and we got here. We were so intentional with how we landed where we did. And he was like, that is not true. We are highly emotional creatures, and that it's our emotions that are driving what we think more than anything else. And so even just knowing that, when you go into a debate or you go into a political discussion where you're like, if I just presented the facts don't actually have much to do with it. There is an emotional tie to the positions that we hold. And specifically when it comes to politics, this identity piece, to change your identity is a long, painful process. And people only change what they think when the cost of staying the same is greater than the cost of changing. So there has to be such a big pain point for people to be like, I can't stay believing this way. I have to change. And that takes time. That takes a lot of work. And I think of it sometimes as someone who needs to be in recovery or in rehab. No one's talking somebody else into going to rehab. That person needs to be like, you know what? I think it's time. Like I need help. But that has to be a self-realization. And I think it's the same when it comes to changing our minds about our politics and our faith. No one's being talked out of these positions. These are deeply held beliefs that require an internal makeover that we can only do on ourselves.
Yeah, Haidt in that book has this incredible image of an elephant and a rider.
Yes.
And we all think it's our intuition that's I'm going to choose this, and really you're sitting on an elephant that kind of leads you, and then you justify why am I going this way? I got to make some smart reason as to why I'm choosing that. And,
yes.
I remember reading that book and I was like, oof.
I know. It was life-changing for me. Life-changing.
That's so good. Okay. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to ask you some questions that I love to ask each of our guests to get your take on the world and all things spirituality. And we'll see where this goes. But we're going to begin by asking you, I love seeing where this question goes. You're on a spiritual podcast where we incorporate wine. So I'm going to ask you if I said to you, I know you're a Manhattan girl, but if I said, do you have like a memory of maybe the best glass of wine you've ever had, or the best bottle, or even just the best setting where you said we enjoyed wine? And if I said, what was like the pinnacle where you go, that was as good as I can ever remember it?
Yeah.
Is there a memory that comes to mind? Can you paint the picture for us? What was it?
Okay, so I'm going to go, it was good, it was memorable, but also led to not so great. So I'm going to take you on a journey.
This is going to be cool. I like it.
So my husband and I, we got engaged at a winery in North Georgia.
Yes, this is already starting off really great. I love it.
So when we were dating, he was a youth pastor at a church that was non-denominational, but strongly connected to Southern Baptist beliefs. And again, we got engaged at this winery in North Georgia. It was wonderful. We shared this bottle of wine. And then afterwards, we were calling all of our friends and family and telling everybody. And he called one of his best friends, Brent, who was on a mission trip at the time with the lead pastor. And Rodney was telling, Brent was like, oh my gosh, tell me, how'd you do it? Like, oh my gosh, tell me everything. So Rodney, not knowing he was on speakerphone, goes on to tell the story of everything. We were at this winery. It was beautiful. It was amazing. Hey, maybe keep that part under wraps, because I know some of the pastors like don't drink and they don't love that, like just keep that, to yourself. And he's like, cool. Not realizing he was on speaker. The mission trip ends. They come back. Lead pastor's back in the office, calls Rodney, and he's like, hey, congratulations. Yeah, it's good. Yeah. So you got engaged at a winery. Yeah. Well, you're not allowed to drink here as a pastor. And Rodney was like, I actually didn't know that. I mean, I knew you guys didn't drink, but I didn't know this was like a rule, like we couldn't drink. And he's like, yeah. And if I find out you're drinking again, you're fired. And he's like, okay, well, what about the wedding? No. Okay, it's the wedding's in Virginia. Like, there's no opportunity of running into anybody. Like, you're not going to see anybody there. And he's like, no, if I find out you drank again, you're fired. And so we call my parents and we're like, hey, I don't think we can have alcohol at the wedding. Like, Rodney could lose his job. And my parents were like, well, we didn't take that job and we like to drink. and our parents or our friends like to drink, and we're paying for the wedding. So we'll get you a nice cup of sparkling apple juice and we'll have wine at our wedding. So the last glass of wine we had in that season was at our engagement. And then it was another 4 years of no alcohol, no wine, nothing until Rodney left that job. And I will say the best glass of wine was the weekend he resigned from that church. And it happened to fall over our wedding anniversary weekend. So we planned a weekend to Athens, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is an adorable little college town, and had a bottle of wine. And that glass had some notes of freedom in it. It really came strong. So we love to tell that story of like, we inadvertently had our last bottle of wine for a season when we got engaged and almost were unemployed as a result.
That is a great story. Tell you what, I have asked that question and gotten a lot of different responses, and I never knew where it was going to go. And yours is right up there at the top. That is a great answer to that. Wow. Okay. So now I call this a speed round.
Okay.
These won't be as long of answers, but just kind of like your take on a variety of things. What is something you used to believe that it turned out later you were wrong about?
Okay. I would say it's exposure to different thinking, the fear that it was a slippery slope, that if you read this, there was no telling where you could end up. And even more so, not just like big difference, like reading an atheist, but like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So it'd be like reading a progressive Christian and being like, they're deceiving you. So it was just kind of like, I just wanted to be careful. I was only reading people in my evangelical lane. And I don't remember, I think maybe Donald Miller was the first kind of like little bit of a turnout.
Back in the day. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Where he talks about being a Democrat. And I was like, whoa, hold up. I don't know about this. But yeah, it was that exposure to difference. I was kind of like, oh gosh, this not only exposes me to things I may have gotten wrong, it sharpens my critical thinking for why I think the way that I do think about other things. And got that way wrong.
Yeah, I remember Blue Like Jazz when they came out. That was you talk about a gateway drug. That book was, for a lot of us, was like, wait a minute.
I know.
Hold up. There's a better way. Like,
yeah. Turns out there is, and it's awesome.
I get emails, not as much anymore in this season of my life, but still regularly, where someone will be concerned about either someone I've quoted or someone I had on the podcast or a book I recommended. And it's exactly what you're describing of, if you start entertaining those ideas, you're going down the road. And I always say back to them, like, I just don't live in this world anymore. Like it's so small. It's so fear-based. Like, you don't need to be afraid of good ideas.
Yes. Yeah. You nailed it. The fear-based. That's real.
What do you see as the main issues facing Christianity in America today?
You said these were going to be faster answers, shorter. I'm like, I don't know.
We're moving quicker than we did on the other questions.
Okay. I would say, I think the biggest issue is probably the allure of power that is facing Christianity as a religion as a whole, and just kind of its access to power and the allure of money. And I would say, obviously, this looks this probably tends more on the Republican side right now in Christian nationalism. But I would say that this is a temptation on both sides. And I think it's just something to be wary of. And, it's the same thing that I think, obviously this is a huge generalized statement, but when you saw Christianity become the religion of the Roman Empire, it changed things, right? And so when you see Christianity kind of be co-opted by a government or by a country, I think there's just a lot to be wary of. So I would say just the allure of power, influence, money, and everything that comes with that. But less on the political side, I would say this thinking, this us versus them thinking, and this purity thinking around our parties and our theologies. And I see very little room right now on both sides of the theological spectrum for people and process. And that worries me. I think of the things that I have changed my mind about theologically and politically, but specifically theologically, they were not decisions I made overnight. And it feels more and more like people are saying, you're either with me or you're not, and you need to be with me on this issue or you're out. And there's fewer and fewer spaces for people who are in process and trying to figure that out. And for people who are willing to engage in those conversations with those who haven't quite arrived on some issues. And so I think that worries me a little bit. It's the ideological purity that is coming from both ends of the political or the theological spectrum, I think, in Christianity, and just not a lot of room for growth and movement on a spectrum, and really overemphasizing destination when it comes to our faith, landing at a certain theology as opposed to beginning the journey, asking the question, having the curiosity and the humility to begin to embark on something. Who knows where it'll take them? But I want to see more spaces where people in progress and in process are welcomed.
That's cool. What's something that's blowing your mind right now?
Okay, I'm going to get this wrong because I just started learning about it. So it's a lot bigger than I'm sure how I'm going to be able to capture it. So I'm just going to tell people, just Google this on your own. Don't take my word for it. But something that I've just started learning about that is blowing my mind is this thing called the trauma triangle. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
Okay. It's trauma/drama triangle. But the idea is that in every conflict that we're a part of, there are 3 roles that we kind of bounce between and the other person bounces between. And it's the role of perpetrator, victim, and rescuer. And it kind of comes back from like unhealed, kind of wounds, childhood stuff that we end up reenacting in our current relationships and conflicts and that sort of thing. And I feel like it's one of those things like when you first learn the Enneagram, you're like, all I can see is people's numbers. You're like, oh my gosh, this person is a total this. Like it's everywhere, right? And I feel like I learned this triangle and I see it everywhere. And I feel like I see it in my relationship with my husband, my relationship with my kids, work relationship, church dynamics. I just feel like I see these roles played out in a way that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is everywhere. And what does it take for us to get out of the drama loop and stop identifying, self-identifying with these roles and be able to see ourselves outside of it. And I think the part that blew my mind was the way I started to see this show up in our politics. I was watching these political ads and I'm like, okay, the other side's the perpetrator, we're the victims, and this candidate is our rescuer. And I just saw it over and over and over again. And so I think it's just been this idea of like, oh my gosh, this is playing out in every aspect of our lives. And I think if we can become aware of it playing out in our personal relationships, larger relationships, whatever, we can begin to move ourselves outside of it and stop being played by it. So that's blowing my mind.
The trauma triangle.
Look it up. Don't take my word for it.
I love it. I love new ideas. Okay. What is a problem that you're trying to solve?
Okay. All right, this one. Okay. I want to back up just a second. So when I talked about in the beginning, things that I changed my mind about in the past 10 years, punitive justice was one of them, and the idea of restorative justice. I was listening to a podcast several weeks ago with, I can't remember her name now. I want to say Mina Marie Brown. I can't remember the author. Anyway, she was talking about punitive justice and restorative justice. And then she talked about the idea of transformative justice. And she was saying, punitive justice is punishment oriented. Restorative is making things go back to how they were. But sometimes the situation that circumstances that were in play when the harm was caused are not worth returning to. So we need to transform them. Not go back and restore, but transform them. So I was listening to that and I was thinking about all of these people in my own family as well, where we saw relationships change in 2016 and 2020. And I think for a lot of us, we thought this is a blip on the radar. This is kind of like a detour. We'll be able to get back on track. And here we are in 2024, where up until a couple of weeks ago, we were having a total replay of 2020, same candidates, same everything, and being like, oh my gosh, maybe this is just the new reality. Our politics is is toxic. Our conversations around it are toxic. This isn't just a detour. This could be the path we're on. And so the problem that I found myself trying to solve is, what does it look like if restoring these relationships is off the table? Is there a way to transform these relationships? Because I don't think we can go back, for some of us, to what we were before. I think in some cases, I don't know that it's healthy to go back. I think boundaries are probably more important now than they've been before, and how we engage. And so what does it look like as a Jesus follower to transform a relationship where maybe peace is off the table for the time being? And so I feel like restorative involves two equal and willing parties to make things right. And I'm wondering if transformative is saying maybe both parties don't want it to be right. Maybe I do. What can I do to do my part to transform my view of this relationship, my view of this person? And what's a way to faithfully do that, that is pursuing peace externally, but maybe even more importantly, internally, and how I view this relationship, and just trying to figure out what does that look like in faith? You know, is it a cop-out? Is there a way to faithfully do that and to kind of live in a disjointed, kind of broken relationship that is different than it was before and may not ever go back to the way it was? Like, just trying to figure out a way to faithfully follow Jesus when there's a lot on the line and there's a lot of brokenness.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. What's something that you're excited about right now?
Well, I have been freelancing, writing and consulting and editing for the past year for a lot of different people and groups. And I am super excited about all of these kind of grassroots movements that I'm seeing of church leaders, and not even leaders, just normal everyday people who are wanting to experience something different in their faith. And they are not kind of drawn to the typical structures and systems that we've seen in place with church. They want to do something new. And it's a new thing that's not reactive to the old or reactive to pain. It's just new, and it's coming from a healthier place than I think it's ever come from before. And so I am really excited about what this kind of next era of church looks like, and moving away from hierarchical structures to mutual flourishing. And what does it look like more dialogue based instead of teaching based? And, you know, what does this look like in people who are not drawn to the influence necessarily or the money that comes with the celebrity status, but it's more about just this kind of grassroots movement of just knowing that with the money comes feeling tied to doing things a certain way, and saying, we don't want to do that. We want to do something new and different, and kind of piece it together as we go. So that really excites me. There's a lot happening on the ground.
Very cool. Is there anything else you want to add that I did not ask you about? And you're like, wait, we got to get into this.
I don't think so. You've covered it all. Congrats.
Thank you. It was the wine. It was a couple glasses of wine, and it's all easy.
That's right.
Okay, so if someone is like, wow, I like her, this is great conversation, how can they find you, connect with you online?
Yeah. Instagram and Twitter, probably Instagram more than anything, SB Anderson. Follow me there, Twitter. My email's up there on Instagram if anyone just wants to chat, talk, whatever. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, I feel like I'm talking to a friend that I've had for a long time.
Same.
We just met, but you feel like a kindred spirit. And I so appreciate the work that you're doing, the ideas you're sharing in this book. I hope more and more people read it, ponder it, and then do the hard work of asking their 90-year-old neighbor why he's got his back flipped out the way he does. And you invite us to something better that is difficult, and it's not easy, but I do think it's better. And we desperately need this in the season we're in. So thank you so much, not only for all the work you're doing, but for taking the time to have a special glass of wine for today on the podcast and spending time with us. We sincerely appreciate it.
Great. And we're going to need an update on your neighbor. So you're not off the hook.
Great. Now there's accountability built in.
That's right.
Oh.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. This was awesome. I appreciate it.
On that note, well, everybody, I want to thank you for joining us. This has been a super fun conversation. And if you're like me, maybe you have some homework you got to go do, or you got to pray about it, build up the courage and go talk to that person. But thank you for joining us. For those watching and listening, so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Cabernet and Pray.